All right, we're here in the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford, and we're talking with our old friend and colleague, Professor James O'Connell, who was the second head of the department here. It's May the 26th, 2005. So, James, thank you very much for inviting us and letting us use your time like this. I want to look back to the early days of peace and conflict studies when people came into the new field, discipline, whatever it was, from all sorts of different backgrounds, and just asking what was yours. Where did you come from intellectually? Where did you come from experientially? How did you actually enter the field?
I entered the field partly because I had lived in Nigeria and I'd witnessed the Civil War, and I'd lived in Northern Ireland, where of course there was another Civil War. And particularly the Nigerian experience taught me the worth of peace. Also, it taught me other things, such as how people can forgive in a way that I've never seen my Irish compatriots do.
Not yet.
But I had then I'd worked in Nigeria as a political scientist, worked in Northern Ireland as an academic administrator. I'd grown tired of administration, and so when the post came up in Bradford, I decided I would apply for it. Agreed it with my wife, and that in a sense is how I came into the area of peace studies. And it was clear to me then that I wasn't, in the sense that it was an area in which few people, if anybody, had been formed.
So what was it that particularly attracted you to this field? What did you hope to achieve?
I thought that some good could come out of reflecting on the nature of peace and on the breakdowns of peace, and that some much good could come out of the endeavour to repair such breakdowns. Moreover, that again, there was tremendous worth in creating the conditions in which peace would be maintained, not simply repairing it after it had broken down. And gradually put these ideas together.
Your own background, though, you were saying earlier, was as a philosopher?
I started life, I did a master's in political history, and then did a doctorate in pure metaphysics.
So when you came into the field by that route, there was a tendency to sort of divide the world off into those who did peace studies and those who did conflict studies. And you came to a department of peace studies. So was that how you understood what you were coming into, a slightly divided field, or didn't it matter, or didn't it occur?
I think I felt it didn't matter. And I was to discover as the years went on that the Department of War Studies in King's College in London was very much a department of the prevention of war, just as we were a department concerned with really the absence of war and the prevention of war. I think that was important because it's very easy for people in peace departments to see others as in some way inferior, just as it is easy for people in other departments to see peace studies as something which is rather ethereal and not empirical enough. So, but really right from the beginning, I had argued that peace, to use Augustine's working definition, peace is the tranquility of order, and that there is a positive dimension of peace, which is collaboration for security, justice and freedom. And there is a negative dimension, which is the setting aside of those things that are inimical to justice, freedom and security. But that, while that is the concept, that in fact peace is also a process. That, Hopkins' famous line, when peace here does house, he comes with work to do. He does not come to brood. He does not come. But in any case, that's the essence of it. And in fact, when I published Adam's inaugural and my own, we called it Peace with Work to
Peace
Do.
with Work to Do, I
Yeah.
remember that,
Mhm.
yes. Yeah. A nice title.
Yes.
I didn't realise it was Hopkins.
Yes.
Who do you think were some of the major influences on the way you thought about and approached the field when you came here? Mm.
If I were to look back for other influences, they came much more from the secular social sciences.
Uh-huh.
That people like Weber
Mm.
and Husserl, on the philosophical side, Heidegger for that matter.
Mhm.
That these were the really I came out of the that post-war era in France, which is often dubbed as the existentialists,
Mhm.
but effectively it was, I've forgotten the term for the moment, seems so odd, but one of the great pioneers who certainly influenced me, Paul Ricard, in fact died last week.
Yes,
It
I
was,
saw the
yeah,
obituary.
Yes, and these were the influences that I took with me, and in measure somebody as well like Aquinas, because I had come up through the scholastic side, even if I was eventually to, in a sense, set it aside.
Mhm. Mm. So when you came to the department here, did you find that there was a dominant mode of thinking already in existence in the department that you had to take into account when you were pushing it intellectually in a particular direction?
Now, there wasn't any dominant mode of thinking.
Mm.
The problem in the department when I arrived was that it was torn between activists
Ah.
and academics.
Mhm.
And the academics, on the whole, kept their heads down.
Mm.
And a lot of the discussions that had gone on before my time were really on how you could be really an activist scholar,
Mm.
which I had really not a great deal of sympathy with. And it was absolutely de rigueur, for example, to go on demonstrations and do things like that.
Ah.
I can remember somebody like Adam being on a demonstration in favour of gay rights. Now, I've absolutely no objection, but I would go as a person
Mm.
rather than as Professor of Peace Studies.
Yeah,
if you-
yeah.
And there were these problems.
Mm.
And in a sense, it got the wrong profile for the department.
Mhm.
It was complicated by the fact that there was a really quite gifted activist in the department called Uri Davis.
Oh yes, I remember
Yeah.
Yuri.
He was a gifted activist and a gifted self-publicist.
Mm.
He was an Israeli, who didn't care much for Israelis,
Mm.
and who was passionately in favour of the Palestinian cause.
Mm.
And if Uri had his way, we'd practically been turned into a Department of Palestinian Studies. But he had a tremendous influence on the students.
Mm.
And there was also Baruch Hirson, who was an old Trotskyite.
Mm.
And he again, the advantage of being a Trotskyite is that you have all the answers. And the students loved that.
Mm.
And of course it absolutely offended me,
Mm.
because I remember learning from a professor at Leuven, look, philosophy consists not of answers, but of deepening the problems,
Mm. Yeah.
which is a very different intellectual approach.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, aside from Bradford, there's always
Mm.
been this, I think, this slight tension in the field between the desire to be practitioners and to
Mhm.
be activists,
Yes.
and the desire to be scholarly and academic.
Mhm.
And did you ever feel that that was something which was an irresolvable problem, or was there a way of resolving it, did you think?
I didn't see initially how one resolved it, and perhaps there I might move on to something which I think is really very important. I mean, when I came, the department was a shambles.
Mm.
There is no other word to describe it. That the students respected no laws. There were no academic criteria imposed on the students. There was no proper examination system. Adam had said to the students, we will have people of a quality that they won't need to be examined, unless insofar as we have to meet those university norms, but we won't take them very seriously. And of course, the academics were still academics, and they resented the fact that the students didn't do any work, and that they did everything, in fact, except work. And one of the pressures I was under was, for example, that instead of putting in essays, people should say they had been out on some activist issue. And I said, no, you'll have to put in your essays. Activism is something which any decent university student is involved in. It's not specific to peace studies. But really, much more important than that was that my first job was to give the department academic respectability. And I was saying to you before we started to talk that I came into a department in which was pretty universally despised in the university as a Mickey Mouse outfit. And I felt that I would never get anywhere unless I could give it academic respectability. And that was the first task that I undertook, really with the colleagues who were there and who were glad to get away from the activism, because the activism had in fact, the students turned quite bitterly on Adam and accused him of being dishonest because he had made promises to them that he couldn't keep. And I've put some of this down on paper, which you can look at. But the truth was then that what I did, and it was not untypical of a political scientist of my vintage, I had in many respects turned the department into a department of international security, because I sought for those areas of the disciplines where, in a sense, there was rigour, because there had been no rigour in the peace focus of the department, because peace had been defined as really everything. And when something is defined as everything, all good things, then it really becomes nothing. And this is one of the problems that had occurred in the department.
Do you think, sorry, let me just ask one additional question. Do you think that was also the nature of the field at that time?
I think it was partly the nature of the field, because it did take quite some time for a focus to come. And really there are many who still haven't managed a proper focus. But nonetheless, although I think I managed to clean the department up academically, bring in proper academic standards, got the staff writing and doing research, I got the students to face up to a proper system of examining, which combined exams with written work, which I think is the best way to do it. But I still remained uneasy, because I accepted that it was a Department of Peace Studies, and I had gradually started really to tease out what I considered to be the nature of peace. And I felt that the Department of International Security wasn't a proper Department of Peace Studies. And it had been like that for a number of years, but I think that it had been a necessary step. And then one day Tom Woodhouse came into my office and said, James, I would like to start a mediation unit, or conflict resolution unit. And as soon as he said it, I realized that I'd got the peace that I was looking for. It's not that it was there implicitly before, but the idea of having a complete unit, and really we called it eventually an institute, that the idea of having that unit, first of all, meant there was an area which was hard-nosed, which was an integral part of the study of peace, but which could also feed into the other parts of the department. And so I said to Tom, look, I think that's a great idea. We will set up the unit. You will be in charge, and I will channel what resources to you that I can. And in fact, within a year, I had got a whole house for them from the only millionaire we knew. But I gave Tom credit because the idea was his. My contribution was to help to organise it within a proper academic unit. But he did a marvellous job, and of course with time, people like Oliver and others joined him. So that, in a sense, these were the two, the crucial moments in the development of the department. But there was one other one. And here the credit must go to Malcolm Danda. The one credit I would take for myself is that I'm capable of recognising a good idea when it comes, and I'm decent enough not to steal it. That when we were trying to, so one of the problems that the department faces, a small department, we were only 6 when I first came, is you can't do everything. And peace is very wide, even benignly interpreted, it is very wide. And we had a number of discussions, and then Malcolm came in one day to the office and said, look, I think he said we could build our courses and our research around these themes. And the themes were, since I will elaborate them, because we did elaborate them with time. The first theme was the peace theme proper. And in that was both the philosophical reflection on the nature of peace, the relationship between peace and justice, and peace and security and freedom. And then at the heart of that, the idea of conflict resolution, which did bring so many things together. So it had both a philosophical dimension and a practical dimension. And whereas I had initially said to the students, we are not activists, scholarship is our activism, I eventually accepted that conflict resolution, in which colleagues could go to different parts of the world, as they still do, that was an area in which you could combine scholarship and activism, to come back to your earlier question. And that was a move on, and it came really from the natural development of the department. The second theme was international security. And of course, particularly in the 80s, the nuclear issue was quite salient, but it wasn't the only one. Our third theme was the politics of development, because most wars take place in the developing world. And our fourth theme was problems of, we called it then, problems of industrialized societies, and including things like race and equivalent issues, race and class, really effectively. And last of all, we said regions in conflict. We began with the Middle East and Northern Ireland. Middle East because it was pivotal. Northern Ireland because it was within our own garden. But we then gradually moved out into Latin America and Southern Africa, and for that matter into Eastern Europe. So these were the 5 themes which still in measure work their way through the department. And we built our it enabled us on the one hand to pin down this diffused concept of peace. On the other hand, it enabled us also to organise teaching and research within the human capacities and academic capacities of the staff. And so we could expand as new people came.
A lot of the early people really wanted to turn this into a social science. Do you think that they ever managed to succeed in coming anywhere near that ambition?
Obviously this issue came up early on, and we didn't try to resolve it in the beginning. But with time, we came to the conclusion, look, that peace studies was not a discipline in the way that, say, political science is a discipline or sociology is a discipline, but that peace studies is an area subject. And an area subject is a subject which is focused by a problematic, but in which several disciplines are brought to bear on that problematic, and that the focus in peace studies was the analysis, the maintenance of peace and the repair of peace, and that one brought together politics, sociology, economics, and also philosophy, because of the reflection on values, that one brought that to bear within an area subject on the focus that peace itself was. And that, I think, was really where I think Bradford stood for a long time. I mean, I don't know what people like Oliver and Paul and Tom, because while Oliver is very philosophical, the others are much more empiricists. But I think that these things are absolutely crucial. And it is a mistake, and I think it was a mistake of the earlier. See, if you didn't have a discipline, people very often thought that you weren't anything. But in point of fact, if you look at a subject like geography, geography is a subject. It's not a discipline. It is really a series of converging disciplines on the care of the earth and on the care of the humans who relate to the earth. And medicine is another example of an area subject, and even bits within medicine, and particularly medicine itself, which is a subject within medicine, that is an area subject, that it's not a discipline in the way that, for example, pathology is a discipline. So I argued these things very strongly because I felt that it kept things, it kept things clear. And so on the one hand, we didn't claim to be disciplined because we didn't have that kind of unity. But on the other hand, that we had the riches of using many disciplines, but in a focused way. And that there were some areas where perhaps one dominantly used politics, but that in other areas, perhaps the most important discipline was economics. You can show, for example, you've had this recent civil war in the Ivory Coast, but if you look at the price of cocoa, with the way that it dropped away to half what people were getting, no wonder there was trouble in the main crop of a West African country. And if you are not able to understand the economic interrelations between the groups in the Ivory Coast, you'll never understand the nature of the conflict there. So in that sense, that while on the one hand, I mean, I'm an old-fashioned philosopher in the tradition of Kant and Hegel and Peirce. On the other hand, I'm also a contemporary political sociologist who knows that facts are absolutely crucial. And I remember arguing with some colleagues in years past, about well, put it in an entirely different way. When I was a young scholar in Nigeria, lots of American visitors, and in the early 1960s, social science had become value-free. And here I was, insisting that there had to be values in social science. I could see the people saying, what do you expect from a bog Irishman? Except that kind of old-fashioned attitude. And then I lived into the 70s with the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And suddenly I found myself reminding younger colleagues, look, there's more to social science than values. Could I just mention one other thing to you, which is not without some poignancy? I was constantly under pressure to change the name of the department because peace seemed so exotic. It seemed, particularly in the university with engineers and that ilk, it seemed kind of so, if you wish, Disney-esque. And I refused to change the name and put this at least 2 different occasions before my colleague. I put it before them, and each time they agreed we would keep the name. And people like Paul Rogers and Malcolm Dandler were very strongly on that. And we kept the name for three reasons. First of all, the most ostensible reason. We said we were founded by the Society of Friends, by Quakers, with that name. And we owe to these founding people who have continued on being good friends, with a small f and a big F. They've kept on being good friends, and it would be a form of betrayal if we were to change the name.
Yeah.
The second thing was that said, look, there is great merit in that which is positive. We could become a Department of Conflict Resolution, but that's a negative approach. Whereas if we keep the concept of peace, it can incorporate conflict resolution. And thirdly, because I'm a Corkman by origin, the Cork never reared a fool. Said, there's great brand recognition in the name.
Looking back to the beginning of the field, it started off with such high hopes and dreams and aspirations. Do you think we've actually managed to fulfill most of them, or have we fallen short in some way, or where are we now, do you think?
I think we're broadly where we should have expected to be. But really one always hopes for more than what happens. I think there is a certain analogy between the way sociology developed. If you go back and look at the really important people in sociology, of the really big names, Max Weber is one. And the other, oddly enough, is Talcott Parsons.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at
Very unfashionable these days.
yes,
Yeah.
but if you look at Talcott Parsons, it's so fascinating when you're a young man and you see all these things. I mean, all the structured analysis that he suggests, and only with time do you realize that it is impossible to apply. That it is a mighty race, but outside the course. And then you go back much more to people like Weber, with the sense of history, but also the capacity to put concepts together. And then you had people like some of the names don't come to me immediately, but there's that superb scholar who worked originally on Indonesia, and then who has since worked, he's an American. But I think that what happened was with time that we worked out much more an empirical methodology. We began to see the worth of conceptualization, even if whether it's peacemaking or peacekeeping or whatever it might be. And that we also realized that there was no alternative to the long, hard slog. And I think that's where we are. That we know that we can make some difference, but that finally, in that sense, we're people who analyze, we're people who clarify, we're people who can offer, in a sense, a glimpse of various roads ahead. But in the last resort, it is other people who will do these things and not us. I mean, that Hegel said about philosophy, which he'd spent his life doing, that it was the owl that flew in the dark when the day was gone. In other words, that it reflected on experience. And that's really what we do. Now, it isn't that we don't train people for conflict situations, but really the discipline, or if you use the areas, the study, the subject itself is of its nature really theoretical, that it can feed into practice, as I'm sure Hegel hoped that his philosophy would, that it would be around when the following day came. But in the last resort, academics, scholars, are academics and scholars, that it is other people who carry the heat of the day within the conflict and equivalent situations. It is others who try to create structures that hopefully will avoid friction, will not break down. And I mean, because when I look back on my own life, one of the most influential periods was when I was a young academic at the University of Ibadan, and Nigeria had gone into civil war. And one of the most crucial things was to try and analyse what was happening, but also to put forward proposals. And I was part of a group that managed to break Nigeria up into states, because I realised that unless you created a number of states, that these great big entities were going to collide. But there, I was much more an activist. I mean, it came out of analysis, but finally, I was a campaigning journalist, which I did with 2 Nigerian colleagues, and only barely escaped being deported. And in fact, I was eventually deported from Nigeria, but I'd had a good innings. So, I mean, obviously, you can, and you've had some quite good scholars, I mean, who've made these practical contributions through journalism. There's that economist, what's his name, Krugman, who writes in the New York Times, who is, I think, a very, very good economist. But what he does is he draws on his scholarship to argue usually an anti-Bush case.
Yes,
And
indeed.
But finally, there is no line that divides, for example, scholarship from journalism. And I think that the same is true in our own subject, that, you know, we're all the time crisscrossing lines. When Bill Clinton became president of the United States, there were 6 websites. And now only God knows how many there are. We tend to forget how quickly things can change. You think of what has happened in interpersonal relations with mobile telephones. I mean, the youngsters are relating to one another in ways that would have been inconceivable to us. So I think one must always be ready for the unexpected. But if I were asked broadly what I would hope, is I hope that we could more and more analyse the nature of globalisation, which is a way of saying how the different parts of the world relate to one another. And not with this moral attitude of globalisation being bad. Because the really important thing is the fact that because of technology, we are going to relate to one another. And the question is, how do we organise those relations? And I think that's really a very important approach. Secondly, that built into that, there must be some concept that combines justice and compassion, because it is a very unequal world. And I think that if the world goes on being unequal, in a world where, you know, the strength of weapons has moved far beyond anything we could ever conceive, and far beyond any immediate hope of defence, and I think we've got to create the conditions within which that technology, including military technology, can be, on the one hand, operate, on the other hand, be contained. And I think, thirdly, we've really got to work on micromanaging relations between groups, as it were, on the ground. And I don't think one can be more specific than that. Now, I may be wrong, but I think that these are the things that really have to go on. But I would also hope that those in our disciplines remain cultured people. In other words, that they are aware of the differences of culture, that they are sensitive to the differences of people, that they know that people don't live on bread alone, but that they do live on bread.
There's always been this sort of division and perhaps tension between the side of peace and conflict research which wants to be activist and applied and real, and the side which wants to be scholarly and rigorous and to be research focused. And have you found that as a tension both here at Bradford and also in the field in general?
You know, academics so often want to be activists. They're not very good activists, and that their contribution really is the pale hue of thought, that it is a reflection on what goes on. And in that sense, I think that we've done a lot of good work. I think, for example, that more than anybody else, Malcolm Chalmers has made clear that the defence industry costs the country money rather than brings in money. And that has been really a very important contribution. And as the defence industry has gradually been winding down, and none of the spurious economic arguments in its favour are now being used. On the other hand, where we have failed, and we tried very hard, was how you might, as it were, create other industries within the defence area. In other words, economic conversion. But on the whole, we haven't succeeded, nor have the firms themselves. So,